Cruiser Canard made the attack. We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back for part 2 of This is America, a 10-part series on the political climate of today's American society. I have here with me to my left Michael Morris, and I am Lloyd Robotham, and let's get our discussion going. Today we will be discussing the debt ceiling. So I guess the best question to lead off this discussion would be for you to explain what exactly the debt ceiling is. What is it?
Well, the debt ceiling is something that Congress put in place in the budget process that essentially says for fiscal year whatever, you can only spend or borrow this specific amount of money. At that point, you hit the debt ceiling and you can't do that anymore without continuing to raise the debt ceiling. It's supposed to be something that limits how much the government actually apportions for spending, but it doesn't really happen because traditionally and historically speaking, every Congress has just continued to raise the debt ceiling. There's always some posturing. One party will say, like, you can't do this because you're putting so much debt on our children, and they'll ultimately raise it anyway. It was raised multiple times under Reagan. When Obama was a senator, he opposed raising the debt ceiling. He didn't really. It was just political posturing. So it's only very recently, in this past year, that we've seen a serious attempt by a political party to not raise the debt ceiling.
Now, you mentioned the debt ceiling being a limit onto how much we can borrow. Who exactly are we borrowing from? And I guess essentially, who are we indebted to?
We hear a lot in the media and among the general public that there's this great fear that we are indebting ourselves to China, that we are taxing and spending, and what we're really doing is borrowing all this money from China to continue to fund whatever we feel like, and that there's this great government bloat, and that the way to get back to getting back to financial solvency is by cutting all this spending, and therefore that will keep us from getting indebted to China.
Right.
China does own a large amount of American debt. So does Japan. Nobody is afraid about Japan. They were back in the 80s. Ultimately, it didn't pan out into anything. In reality, the U.S. Treasury actually owns most of the public debt of the United States. If we're indebted to anyone, it's actually ourselves. There is no real reason to be afraid of China owning public debt.
So if the debt is really owed to ourselves, then is the debt really a problem?
Well, it's a problem in sort of the psychological sense in that it can scare off some investors. But in reality, it's really not. I mean, there are far greater problems that we have to deal with. One of the things that you'll find a lot of people freaking out about over the debt is the idea that China, again, will someday call in our debt. They'll use it as some great, war tactic, and they'll just call it in, and that's it for the American economy. Well, no, that's absurd, because what happens if the American economy collapses, which is what would happen if China called in the debt that they own because we couldn't pay it back, is that it would cause the American economy to crash, which would in turn cause the Chinese economy to crash because the Chinese and American economies are extremely intertwined. This is why it's not a real threat that other countries own any part of the debt. In your personal life, why is that a problem? It's a problem because there are authorities who can come and arrest you if you don't pay your debt.
Right.
Nobody can do that with countries. It just can't happen.
Right.
If you're like a poor third world country, then maybe a first world country could come in and do that to you, but there's no country on earth that is going to come and arrest the United States or commit financial suicide by causing the United States to default on its debt. The United Nations, in theory, they couldn't even really do it, but if they were a one-world government, they could, but they're not. So there's really just no substantial reason to be afraid of it.
So what would have happened if we defaulted?
Well, exactly that. The United States would have seen financial collapse. It's the exact same thing that would have happened, basically, if you default on your debt. What people don't understand about the debt ceiling is that it's not, when you raise it, you're not raising it for the next year. you're raising it so that you can pay for things you already apportioned to pay for last year during the last fiscal budget session. So therefore, if you don't raise it, you're telling your investors and the people who have bought your debt, we can't pay your debt. That's why you default.
So the question becomes, how did we allow the debt to get so far gone? Why is this debt ceiling thing an issue? How did we get to this point?
Well, conservatives are right about one thing, and that's because this is an actual fact, not a conservative idea, which is that you will go into debt when you spend more than you bring in. Everybody knows that. The thing is, Republicans have tried to frame this very successfully as if this is because of Democratic presidents and Democratic policies. It's not. As if you look at the Clinton administration, you can see that if you spend, but you also have proper revenues to fund that spending, then it's not an issue. You won't have a massive debt. The debt as we have it now came strictly out of a Republican administration, the Bush administration. It came from the Bush tax cuts, because what happened was he didn't cut spending, he lowered taxes. Therefore, you had continued amounts of spending with lower taxes, which means you're bringing in less revenue, so he had to borrow money to be able to continue funding the programs that he was still spending. Because of two huge wars, which cost trillions of dollars, which were paid for entirely on borrowed money, he didn't raise taxes as Americans traditionally did during wartime. And thirdly, because of the economic collapse in 2008. What happened there was so many people lost their jobs that they're not paying in income tax, and therefore the government brings in less money while continuing to spend, so that it amasses this big debt. So the answer to lowering this debt is not cut the spending, it's raise the taxes and cut spending in areas like the military.
Since we have this issue of the debt ceiling, and even if it's not an actual issue, and it is a political one. So what is your proposed solution for then getting at this debt and trying to lower it?
It's actually, it's extremely simple. It's deceptively simple. It's pretty much one of the most obvious things you can think of. There's two ways to cut a debt. You either cut spending or you raise taxes. Or there's the third option of doing both. The whole issue with the debt ceiling was Republicans were just using the debt ceiling as an excuse to hold the economy hostage so that they could force the president into spending cuts. They refused to raise taxes on the rich because it is the rich who pays for their campaign contributions, are the ones who get them reelected. So they were taking the debt ceiling, hyping it up into this great issue and saying, if you don't cut spending, we won't vote in favor of raising the debt ceiling because we have to get the debt under control. If you only cut spending, though, what's going to happen is that the things that are the big programs that Republicans are going to want to cut are things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare programs, things that actually benefit people, human beings. So it's going to cause huge disastrous problems for the poor and the middle class in this country. You could do the other thing, which is raise taxes. Now, maybe you don't want to raise taxes on the poor or on the middle class right now because they're in a recession, but the rich can certainly afford to have taxes raised on them. As I've explained before, they're at historic lows. The other thing you could do, again, is raise taxes and cut spending because there is some bloat in government, particularly in the defense area of government, considering the size of the two wars going on, the amount of money that government spends on the Pentagon budget, even outside of simply the wars. So if you cut elements like that and you raise taxes on the rich, then over time you will be able to get the debt down. This is, for example, why we were moving far ahead in decreasing our debt even into a surplus under the Clinton administration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morris. That was very informative, and I hope you were well informed. That concludes part 2 of our 10-part series called This is America. Join us again next week when we'll be talking about the issue of unemployment.